the last macromolecule we're going to look at that gets digested are the nucleic acids. So we're going to talk about nucleic acid digestion and absorption. So I've drawn here my enterocytes. So these are cells. Nucleic acid digestion and absorption occurs in the duodenum and the jejunum. So these are going to be simple columnar cells that are in that area. These cells have microvilli, and we call that the brush border. And we've seen this before. There are enzymes within the brush border that will complete the digestion of these molecules. So we're talking about nucleic acids, so we're talking about DNA and RNA. And DNA and RNA are basically strands of nucleotides. And if you remember, a nucleotide contains a phosphate group, a pentose sugar, and a nitrogen base. And a DNA molecule and an RNA molecule are strands of these things linked together. Looks kind of like this. Very kind of like this, but good enough, right? So in the lumen, so this is the lumen of the small intestine. We're in the duodenum here, and of course we're getting pancreatic enzymes. And part of those pancreatic enzymes, or within those pancreatic enzymes, are special enzymes that cut these DNA and RNA strands into the individual nucleotides. So these are going to be deoxyribonuclease and ribonuclease. So these enzymes will break up these DNA and RNA strands into their individual nucleotides. And we remember the nucleotide has the phosphate group. Right, has a pentose sugar and a nitrogen base. So once we have these free nucleotides, now we break the nucleotides up into their individual components, and that's what occurs at the brush border. So at the brush border, make this again here. So at the brush border, the first thing that happens is we have there's an enzyme called phosphatase. And phosphatase basically cleaves off the phosphate group. So now we have our little phosphate over there, and then what we have left here is the pentose sugar and the nitrogen base. And there's another enzyme here called Nucleosidase. nucleosidase. And it breaks the covalent bond between the pentose sugar and the nitrogen base. So now we have our phosphate group, we have our pentose sugar, and our nitrogen base. Along the membrane there, the luminal membrane, there is a transporter. And this is a transporter that requires ATP to work. So this is active transport. So these molecules are actively transported through this transporter into the cell, into the enteric cell. So here comes the sugar, and here comes the phosphate. And once it is in here, we have our blood here. And once it's actually, all these molecules are in the enterocyte, they passively diffuse into the blood. And from there, of course, they go to the liver. All right, so basically, in nucleic acid digestion and absorption, we're talking about, again, DNA and RNA. All right, so they are broken down into their nucleotides. And then from there, they're broken down into the phosphate group. Sorry about that. The phosphate group, a pentose sugar, and nitrogen base. And these are the elements that get absorbed into the blood. So that is nucleic acid digestion and absorption.